class, we're going to be learning about culture today, which is chapter 3 in your workbook. What is culture? Culture is the ways of thinking, the ways of acting, and the material objects that together form a people's way of life. It encompasses all that we say, know, make, and do in our efforts to survive and thrive. And it's hard for us to see our own culture, so we may not recognize the extent to which it shapes us or it defines who we are. It's an invisible structure, and we hardly acknowledge its existence, but it's there, shaping our thoughts and shaping our actions. And I always like to compare it to a fish in a pond. So you have a fish in a pond, and the fish can see plants, the fish can see the rocks, the fish can even see other fish. But the fish really doesn't notice the water. It's kind of invisible to the fish. It blocks it out. And that's the way culture is in our society. It's there, it's all around us, but we really don't notice it. And examples of culture include language, knowledge, material creations, and rules for behavior. Standards of beauty. Standards of beauty can vary across cultures. What is beautiful here in the United States may not be beautiful in Japan or beautiful in Africa. Style. There are so many different styles depending on what culture you're talking about. And hand gestures. While people may think that hand gestures are universal, they are not. Every culture has their own hand gestures that they make, and they have different significance depending on that culture. The reason why culture is so important is because it simplifies our day-to-day interactions, which is why we preserve it and pass it along to others. So imagine if we are meeting for class one day and I walk in, and instead of saying good morning, I say magandang umaga. Well, a lot of you probably don't know what language I just used, but I used Tagalog, which is a language spoken by Filipinos. And if you are Filipino, you probably would understand me if you speak that language. But if you're not, which most students are going to be different from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, you're probably not going to know what I just said. So I walk in and I just finish greeting you in Filipino, and then I hand out your assignment, which is also written in Tagalog language, and then I put up a slide that's entirely in Portuguese. And then let's just make it even more difficult. Why not? Half of the class only speaks Chinese, and the other half only speaks Spanish. So how difficult would it be to conduct a class that day when nobody speaks the same language? We don't have shared meaning. How would I be able to teach you anything? Well, I wouldn't, because we wouldn't have the same references or the same language. So it'd be very difficult, and that's why it's important for all of us to speak the same language or to have these shared meanings, because it really simplifies our lives. And the way that culture is transmitted or passed along is through communication, such as books, art, video recordings. Also, your family passes culture on to you, mass media, among peers, and at school. One aspect of culture is being able to recognize patterns or symbols. And here I have a picture of a very famous logo. It's the FedEx logo. And I usually show this to my students, and I ask them to point out the logo. And they say, oh, the logo is FedEx. It's, the letters, like the purple letters, FED, and then it's the red letters, EX. And then I say, no, the logo, what's the logo? And they're like, that is the logo. Well, if you can see, I don't know if you can make it out, but there's an arrow in the FedEx logo. I'm going to switch it over to the next slide so you can see it a little bit better. So hopefully now you can see the arrow because it's been highlighted. But that is actually the logo in the FedEx symbol. And the reason that people have such a hard time seeing this is because when we learn culture and once we've been socialized into our culture, after a certain period of time, we already learn how to read letters or symbols. And so when we read them, we ignore the negative space. We've been taught to ignore the negative space that occurs within letters and to just look at the letters themselves. So on the previous slide, you had the white negative space in between the E and the X. And so that is what I'm talking about. That's the sort of things that we're taught to ignore. But it's very interesting because if you show this same logo to a child that is probably 4 or 3 years old, usually preschool age, they will point out the arrow before they recognize the letters, and that's because a lot of them have not been exposed to letters yet. They've only been exposed to shapes, so they have an easier time looking for the shapes than the letters. And then after you've gone through kindergarten and beyond, you have a harder time looking at the shapes, and you can recognize the letters a lot easier. And it's because you've already learned to recognize those cultural symbols. And here's another very popular symbol, an optical illusion that has been circulated through the internet countless times. And this symbol is the old lady versus the young lady. So some of you may have seen it before, but usually when people see it, they're asked whether they see an old lady or a young lady. So some people might say, I only see an old lady. Other people might say, I only see a young lady. And some people say, I see both. I can see the old lady and then also the young lady, like it's alternating. And everybody's right because you can see each of those. You can see the young, the old, and you can see both. However, some people have a harder time looking for the older lady than the young lady. Most people see the young lady before they see the old lady. And the young lady, if you notice or if you see her, she's looking away from the audience. And then the old lady is kind of looking down, tucking her chin in her fur. I wish I had a picture that kind of showed little arrows kind of highlighting how to see the old lady, how to see the young lady, but I couldn't find any online. So you're just gonna have to search for them. Maybe search for a video of this online so they can help you see the young or the old lady. But the point that I wanted to make about this picture is that the reason we don't see, kind of like the way when we're looking at the FedEx symbol, the reason we don't all agree that this is a young lady or this is an old lady is because we haven't been exposed to this symbol very much. If we had been exposed to this symbol since we were in kindergarten, say for example, in all of our textbooks, and they told us since we were 5 that this picture is of an old lady, and they just kept teaching us that this was an old lady picture from the moment we were in kindergarten all the way through college, then right now when you'd be looking at this picture, you would say this is an old lady. And yeah, maybe I see the young lady, but I see the old lady more than anything. So that's what happens with culture. When they tell you to read a symbol in a certain way, you start seeing it that way. But if it's a symbol that you're not used to, then you're going to read it the way you see it, right, in reality. So, culture exists within the context of society, and it's only through our interactions with one another that we are able to create culture and share it with one another. So, I have a question for you. Are there any aspects of culture shared by all people around the world? And I have a hint right there. So, there's going to be some aspects of culture shared by all people around the world because I already gave you a hint. But I want you to think of some on your own. You could pause the presentation if you'd like right here, or we can keep going. So, for the cultural aspects that are shared by people all around the world, usually when I do this exercise with my face-to-face classes, they come up with a number of things that are shared by people all around the world, and one of them is food, music, dance, language. Another one is sport, folklore like stories, funeral rites, housing or dwellings, marriage rituals, trade, and I think that's the end of my list. So at the very left here, we see representations of each of those, of the things that we just talked about. So the things that I just named, they're called cultural universals. These are common practices or beliefs shared by all societies. And if you could see the very top picture, that is a ritual dance in China. And that dance is going to look a lot different if you go to Mexico, say, for example. So in Mexico, their traditional cultural dance is folclórico, which is when they have these big skirts and they kind of flail them around. They also have like the Aztec dancers. So common there's common aspects in all cultures, but they are expressed differently. Same thing for the middle picture. The middle picture is of a dwelling in a tribal village. So that's how a dwelling in a tribal village looks, but a dwelling in an urban area in the United States looks a lot different. And then the bottom picture is the one concerning marriage rituals. So a marriage ritual in India looks a lot different than a traditional American marriage. Culture also involves transformation and diffusion. It transforms through innovation, and innovation is the process of introducing a new idea or an object into a culture. And really, it's what separates humans from other species. For example, a robin bird. It can build a nest in this year, 2016, and if you look at that nest and compare it to a nest built in 2006, the nest is going to look exactly the same. And then again, if you compare it to its great, great, great robin bird ancestor in 1016, that nest is going to look exactly the same. But why is that? Why is it that the robin bird's nest looks the same in the year 1016, 2006, and 2016? Why doesn't it change? Well, that's because robins don't have the ability to be innovative. They are born with a nest building instinct that tells them that they need to build a nest and how to build it, but they cannot be innovative. They can't all of a sudden start building a roof on their nest or using twigs that are colorful, because that's not part of their nest building instinct. However, humans, because we are special in that way, that we are able to be innovative, we can build our houses however we like. So a dwelling from 1016 doesn't look anything like houses from now. Even in the same decade, you can have so many architectural styles, and usually those styles change every decade or so. But you can have so many different types of dwellings, even in the same year, depending on what culture you're coming from, even. And there's two main forms of innovation: discovery and invention. So, a discovery involves making known or sharing the existence of an aspect of reality, such as the earth is not flat, or the earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around, or even gravity. The discovery of gravity was something that changed our aspect of reality. And another type of innovation is invention. So that's when you combine existing cultural items into a form that didn't exist before. And an invention, it could be physical or it could be conceptual. Conceptual means that it's an idea. So you could have an invention of a new idea. And an example of a physical type of invention would be the car, a cell phone, the light bulb. Any of those are valid inventions. And an idea, a conceptual invention, would be democracy. So the type of government that we have, that's a conceptual invention. Or even a religion. A religion could be an invention. We all know that Catholicism was one of the oldest Christian religions, but that Martin Luther was upset with the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church had what you call indulgences, so you could pay your way into heaven, and he didn't agree with that. So he protested, and he put up his 95 Theses on the church doors, and he said he was going to break away from the church and create a new religion, which was the Protestant religion. And that's where a lot of the Lutheran and Baptist and Calvinist religions come from. There's so many different religions that came from that movement. But yes, that idea, it was a conceptual invention. A Protestant religion is a conceptual invention. And lastly, we can change culture through diffusion. So this is the process by which a cultural item spreads from one group to another, or from a society to a society. And the way that it spreads is through the mass media, having exposed other cultures through the television or through the internet. Immigration, just think about here in California, we have so many different places to eat. And it's mostly because we had so many immigrants. We have Mexican, and we have Chinese and Japanese and Vietnamese. And it's all because of immigration that we are able to have all these different types of restaurants. And tourism. So when we go to other countries, we are exposed to other cultures. So here on this slide, I have a couple of examples of cultural diffusion. So let's start with the top left picture with the tribal couple. If you notice the way they're dressed, you can see that one part of the way that the male is dressed has been diffused into his tribal culture, because usually tribal people do not wear soccer jerseys, but in this case the cultural diffusion has taken place and he is wearing a soccer jersey. And then the next picture I wanted to focus on was the male in the middle at the top, and he's wearing plugs, which are those little round things in his ear. And if you notice the picture to the right of him, it's a native person also wearing plugs on their ears. And I always ask my class, who diffused this style to what culture? So was it the white male that diffused that style into the native person's culture, or the native person that diffused that style into the American culture? And of course, they always get the question right. They know that it's the native person that was the first one to use the plugs, and then later it was adapted by American culture and by other youths around the world. But yes, so the native person was the first one to wear it. At the bottom right, I have a picture of a Japanese McDonald's. And so that McDonald's is an American company, and that was diffused out into Japan. And what's really interesting about McDonald's is that they always try to adapt also. They diffuse out to the culture, but they also try to adapt to the culture. So when I was in Hawaii, I was like in shock when I saw their big breakfast. So their big breakfast consists of the scrambled egg, white rice, and a couple of slices of spam. So they have also the traditional breakfast, which has the biscuit and the egg and the sausage and the hash brown. But it seemed to me that the Hawaiian big breakfast was more popular among the locals than the traditional big breakfast that we have here on the mainland. So, another one that I wanted to talk about too was the McDonald's in India, because in India they don't eat beef. A lot of them are not vegetarian, but it's taboo for them to eat beef because of the religion. So they'll make veggie burgers for them, and they also sell curry, like in little boxes. They'll make like curry items in the Indian McDonald's. And then on the left there, at the bottom left, I have a picture of Psy, which is a very famous Korean pop singer, and he sang that song Gangnam Style, which came over to the United States and was a mega hit. And it has, I think, the most YouTube views of all time. So it was a song that was in an entirely different language, Korean language, but it was a hit here in the United States, which is pretty unheard of. So it was nice to see that. And then we have, in the middle, I saved the best for last, Jollibee. So the United States exported KFC over to the Philippines. And the Philippines, they love the fried chicken. So they said, how can we improve this? And they decided to make Jollibee. And Jollibee carries fried chicken, and they carry hamburgers and spaghetti. But you can get fried chicken with a side of spaghetti. It's very odd if you ever go there, but it's so delicious. Their chicken's so delicious. They actually have one in Eagle Rock, and they have another one in West Covina. Those are the two that I know of. But yeah, so then the Filipinos made their version of the KFC, and then they diffused it back out to us, because now they have restaurants over here, and they also have a restaurant in Hawaii. So there are three primary types of culture, and that is material culture, cognitive culture, and normative culture. Material culture is our physical modification of the natural environment to suit our purposes. And we can modify mostly anything in the natural environment, such as cotton plants. We modify cotton plants to be able to make our clothing, or we make material from cotton plants that allows us to then make our furniture coverings, or we modify trees to make books, or to make timber so that we can build our homes. And technology is also a big part of material culture. And I know you are all familiar with technology, but I'm gonna give you guys some examples. Cell phones, computers, microwaves are all technology. And actually, I have a picture of two items at the bottom there, the chopsticks and the fork. And these are also technology. However, they're considered low tech because they don't have all these mechanisms inside of them. But yes, these photos are examples of physical objects that are important to a particular culture, but also very distinctive to that culture. So in Eastern culture or Asian culture, chopsticks are used more often than Western utensils such as forks and spoons and knives. And whenever we talk about material culture, we have to talk about cultural lag. So cultural lag refers to the period of adjustment when the non-material culture is struggling to adapt to the new conditions of the material culture. And the best example that I can give you is the one about cell phones and driving laws. So cell phones, as many of you know, have been out since the 1990s. And before, in the 1990s, not that many people had them. Only the very rich could afford cell phones, especially because they were such a pain in the neck to carry around. They used to have them like in backpacks that you would have to carry, and then from that backpack there would be a corded phone sticking out where you can talk. And then later in the mid 90s to late 90s, they started making the standalone cell phones. And finally, around early 2000s, like 2002, 2001, you start seeing the cell phone being mass produced and available for more consumers. So all the way from 1990 up until 2008, there were no laws concerning distracted driving or driving with your cell phone. And so it took literally, 20, I'm sorry, 18 years. 18 years for the non-material culture, which is our laws, to catch up with the material culture. So it wasn't until like maybe the mid 2000s when they started noticing that people were getting into auto collisions that were being caused by this technology, cell phones. Nobody anticipated that the cell phones would have this much of an impact on people, and that people would be so impatient to talk on their phone that they would do that while they were driving, even though it was extremely dangerous, probably even more dangerous than drunk driving. So after all these studies came out and people started complaining, then they finally passed the hands-free law in 2008 here in California, and people started getting tickets, like $500 tickets, when they were using their cell phone while driving. But yes, that's cultural act because it took a long time for our laws to catch up. Another element of culture is cognitive culture. And cognitive culture consists of our mental and symbolic representations of reality, and includes our values, beliefs, knowledge, and all other representations constructed to make sense of the world around us. And a very important aspect of culture is language. Language is a system of shared symbols. It includes speech, written characters, numerals, nonverbal gestures, and expressions. And language is social. There's no inherent meanings in the sounds we make when talking or when writing. Words get their meaning from us. And also, language is socially constructed and can change. Just think about the way we speak English now. The way we speak English now is not the same if you compare it to the way we used to speak English in the 1800s or even before then. So language is constantly changing. And to show you that language is constantly changing, I have Merriam-Webster's editions for 2015. So these, 2014, I'm sorry. These are all the words that were added to the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So just have a look at the words. There's a lot of different ones on there that maybe you're not familiar with, but I'll point some out right now, or I'll define some right now, because I know usually students have the same questions, but you can pause it or you can just look at the words. I'm just going to stay silent for a bit. So number one is catfish. Now, catfish does not refer to the food catfish, but instead to this new phenomenon where people pose as other people online, and then when they meet that person in real life, they realize that they've been duped. So that's a catfish. Another one that I wanted to talk about was crowdfunding. So crowdfunding is when you ask people to kind of be angel investors, where you have a project that you want to get off the ground, but maybe your traditional banking institution doesn't want to help you with that. So you go online and you ask people to give you a chance and invest in your invention, and then many people can donate to you until you hit your target. Like maybe it's $1,200. So if enough people donate to you and you hit $1,200, then that means you reach your goal and you get to keep all that money so that you can finance your project. Hashtag was barely added, which I believe hashtags have been in use for a few years now, but they just added it. Pho. So I guess pho has become very popular in recent years, and they just added that. But that's the Vietnamese soup. I don't know if you guys have had it. Another one, selfie, just got added, and steampunk, which I know many of you may not be familiar with that word, but I actually have a picture on the next slide, so don't worry, I'll explain it to you. And turducken, I think somebody was saying that it's a duck. A chicken inside of a duck inside of a turkey. So, and usually they said that it's like if you want to prank somebody on Thanksgiving, that's what you do. You could stuff a chicken inside of a duck and inside of a turkey. And another way that language changes, and what I wanted to bring up was emojis, because I feel that emojis are an evolving part of our language. Um, I mean, now when people want to convey emotion, they don't really focus on conveying emotion through their words, especially because of text messaging and such. So sometimes people are just trying to get off a quick message and they don't have time to really get into their emotions. So instead, they'll use an emoji to express how they're feeling. So even if it's a simple message like, okay, you could put an angry face, you could put a happy face, or you could put a confused face, and the person will know where you're coming from. And I always have issues with this in my online class, because my online classes, for some reason, they think it's okay to use emojis in their discussion boards. So I have to remind them constantly to not use emojis to try to convey emotion. Instead, they should use words, but they're not used to it. So I have to start taking points off by like second or third week when they keep using these emojis. So yeah, it's definitely a very important aspect of language now, emojis, and I think they're going to continue to be as we keep evolving. Here's the picture that I had for you for number 11 on the last page. This is an example of steampunk. And steampunk, it's as if electricity was never discovered and everything is still powered by steam. And it's usually set in the Victorian era or in the Wild West. And on the left there is a picture of a famous, I think she's a comic book character. That's what I was told by one of my students. But her name is Lady Mackinnica. I guess they have comic books of her. But yes, this is a fiction subgenre in books. So they have a genre in there, and then it's also a comic. Okay, class, we're still on cognitive culture, but another aspect of cognitive culture is nonverbal communication, and this is when we use gestures or our facial expressions or other visual images to communicate. And in my opinion, this is just as important, or even more important, than spoken language when you're trying to communicate or listen. Because people can be sarcastic or even insincere with their words. And so the best way that you know if somebody's being honest, dishonest, or if they're being sarcastic or not, is to look at their body language. You might also analyze tone, but that's more verbal communication. I think even just looking at the body signals, the expressions will help you. And nonverbal communication is learned through social interaction. We don't all communicate the same across cultures. Every culture shows their citizens how to show shame, how to show distress, pleasure, sadness, happiness. So a lot of people think that these are universal expressions, but they're not. They're universal emotions. Everybody has shame and sadness and happiness, but the way that we express happiness, the way that we express shame is different depending on what culture we're coming from. Here's an example of nonverbal culture. Hand gestures. This is a fun activity. So the top middle, let's look at that hand that it looks like it's telling you to stop. So in the United States, this symbol means stop. Now, if you were to do that in Greece, you'd be in big trouble because you're basically telling the person to go to hell. So be careful if you go to Greece and you try to tell somebody to stop, because they will not understand. They will not understand it the same way that we understand it here in the United States. The second symbol I wanted to look at was on the left of the stop hand is a peace sign, or what we know as a peace sign here in the United States. Again, this symbol, while it's a symbol of peace and love here in the United States, is not a nice symbol in the UK or in Australia. That is the equivalent of giving someone the middle finger in the UK or in Australia. So do not do that. People will not be happy. At the very bottom, you see a thumbs up. So usually a thumbs up indicates that somebody's done a good job here in the United States. Well, if you do that same gesture in Greece, you are telling the person up yours. So be careful again. I guess Greece has a lot of different hand signals than we do. And then to the left over there, you have somebody holding their elbow. If you do that in most Latin American countries, they understand it as someone being stingy. That's a symbol for someone being stingy. And then on the right, you have another symbol, which is an Italian or French symbol. And you may know it from the mobster movies, because they do the chin flick in mobster movies. But that means to get lost in Italy and France. Like, get lost, get out of here. But yes, so you can see that hand gestures are not universal. We have different means in different cultures. Another aspect of cognitive culture is values. So values are collective conceptions of what's considered good, desirable and proper, or bad, undesirable and improper in a culture. And some examples of values can include family, love, community, opportunity, freedom. Freedom is an American value. Knowledge, nonviolence, equality is another American value. So people often disagree on values, which can lead to social conflict. I have a picture of abortion picketers here at the bottom. And so I always ask the class, what is the difference between a pro-choice and a pro-life person? What are their values? And so I ask first for pro-choice, or for the people that feel that abortion should be legal. They always tell me, well, they value being in control of their own body. So I say yes. So they value personal freedom. They value their reproductive rights above all else, right? Just freedom, pretty much freedom over their body. And then I ask them, well, what do the pro-lifers value? What is their value? And they say, well, they value life. And then I say, yeah, they do value life, or the protection of unborn life. So when you look at it, or look at that issue from both perspectives, and you look at both values, you can see why so many people are on the fence about it. They don't want to get involved or be associated with one side or another, because these are both valid points. You got personal freedom on the one end, but then you also have the protection of unborn life on the other end. So there's a lot of social conflict because of this disagreement on values. And it's not just with the abortion controversy. There's so many other controversies in society that are basically, how do you say, they are fueled by this difference in values. So the last type of culture that I wanted to focus on is normative culture. And normative culture focuses on how we act. A norm is an established standard of behavior maintained by society, and there are two types of norms in every society. You have folkways and you have mores. So folkways are norms governing everyday behavior. This is the type of behavior when you're out in public. And I like to call it the unwritten rules of society. And so certain things that you do when you're out in public would be like holding the door open for somebody. If they're very close to you, like maybe 3 feet away, you'll hold the door open for them. If they're like 10 or 20 feet away, maybe not. Those are just the unwritten rules. Um, Also, waiting in line. So, in the United States, you know that if you want to get some sort of a service, you have to wait in line. If somebody cuts in front of you, you could either be mad about it and think that that person's rude, or another folkway would be to call it to their attention. Like, excuse me, I was in line before you. Another type of folkway would be coughing away from people, especially like if you're sick and you don't want to spread germs. You just kind of cough away from people. So these are all behaviors that are governed in our society. And another type of norm is a more. So these norms are a lot more serious, and violating them can have serious consequences. If you don't hold the door open for somebody, or if you happen to cough on somebody, no big deal, you might get a dirty look. But with mores, it's a little bit more serious because these are norms that are deemed highly necessary to the welfare of society. So um, some mores that I can think of would be we don't murder each other. So that's just established in our society. You shouldn't plagiarize. That's another more. Um, you shouldn't be unfaithful. So and some mores are so strong that they take the form of laws. So at the very bottom there, you can see that laws are formal norms that are enforced by the state. So we have laws against running red lights, because if you just go around running red lights, you're going to affect the welfare of the rest of the people around you, because you can cause a collision and they can die. So that is why we have those sort of mores written into a formal law, because it's depending on the welfare of society. And then you have a taboo. So a taboo is a norm ingrained so deeply that even thinking about violating it evokes strong feelings of disgust, horror, or revulsion for most people. And when I think about taboos, I usually think of cannibalism. So it disgusts people to think that they could eat other people. Incest. So incest means having sexual relations with your immediate family members, such as your brother or your father, like if you're a female. So that is incest. And then another type of taboo would be pedophilia. So pedophilia is when you have like feelings of love, and not like more like sexual love towards a young child. So that's a taboo in our culture. So what does it look like when we break social norms? Well, I have a video that I like to show in class. I don't know if it was taken down from YouTube or what, but you can look up various videos on YouTube of people breaking social norms in public. There's so many videos out there, and you'll see what it looks like. It's very awkward. Like if people just all of a sudden start talking to someone in an elevator, like to a stranger in an elevator, the people react by saying, "Excuse me, do I know you?" Or like kind of thinking this person must be crazy. Um, So you can see various examples of that on YouTube if you want to just look up breaking social norms in public. And how do we enforce norms? How do we make sure that people, like complete strangers, don't talk to us while we're shopping in the supermarket, or that they come up and hug us out of nowhere? Well, we use sanctions. So sanctions can be penalty or rewards for conduct concerning a social norm. And they can be both positive and negative because they're, like I said, they're either penalties or rewards. So a negative sanction can include fines, threats, imprisonment, loss of social status. For example, a man who cheats on his wife can face several sanctions. They can face the sanction of having to go to court to get a divorce, um, being sued for spousal support, losing their social status, because now you're no longer a married individual, now you are a divorced individual. And some friends will choose like what side they want to go to, whether it's going to be the man's side or the woman's side. So it might depend on who was the cheater. Usually the person who's the victim gets to keep all the friends. So these are all negative sanctions. Oh, also, your children might be disappointed in you if you break up their family. So these are all negative sanctions. And then positive sanctions, a pay raise, a medal, a word of gratitude, or a pat on the back. Also, staying married for a very long time will allow you to have wedding anniversaries like in your 20 years of marriage, 30 years of marriage, 50 years of marriage. So that would be considered even a positive sanction. Or just people saying, oh wow, you guys have been married for 20 years, that's awesome, I wish I could have a marriage like yours. So those are all positive sanctions. So within cultures and among cultures, you have what is called cultural variation. So the first type of cultural variation is called a subculture, which is a group within society that's differentiated by its distinctive values, norms, and lifestyle. Um, I think mostly anything can be a subculture as long as it's a group that is very different from mainstream society. But I always like to think of like skaters or of like goth subculture. So each of those groups have their own values. Like for skaters, they value, you know, danger, excitement, adventure. They have norms and they have a lifestyle. So what's normative for skaters is to kind of have this attitude of like independence. They don't need a lot of oversight from their parents. Um, they're kind of always just, taking life as it comes and um, going out and skating with their friends and going to skate parks if they're available. If not, they do whatever, they use whatever items are available to them to try to get better at their craft. So that's what they value, being good at skating. And sometimes they even have, some subcultures may have what you call your slang or your argot. Skaters, I'm not too familiar with like a specific slang that skaters use. I think for them it would just be youth subculture slang. And you guys are also familiar with it, like when people say "bay" or "YOLO" or "swag." So these are all words that are probably not in anymore, but were in at some point. And so that's like youth subculture. They like to use those type of specialized languages. And then you have what they call a counterculture. So this is a subculture that deliberately opposes certain aspects of the larger culture. And I always give the example of the hippies of the 60s or terrorists even, because terrorists oppose certain aspects of the larger culture. Like in the Middle East, terrorists um, do not agree with the way the government is handling things, so they decide to take things into their own hands and try to create social change, so that they can make a society that more accurately reflects what they think is correct. And finally, you have culture shock. So culture shock is when you come across a new culture and you feel disoriented, you feel uncertain, or sometimes even fearful when you encounter this unfamiliar cultural practice. And I always use the example of studying abroad, but my students always come up with some very good culture shock experiences. Like I had this one student who traveled to Japan, and she said that she was in complete shock because they do not have public trash cans over there. It's like in Japan, you have to hold on to your trash. And what the people do over there is that when they finish eating a bag of chips, they'll get the bag, flatten it out and fold it into a little tiny square and then put it in their book bag, because a lot of Japanese people carry book bags with them, and I think it's for that reason, the fact that they have to carry their trash around. And so then they take their trash home and either throw it away there or they recycle it, because I guess Japanese culture is really big on recycling. But if you were over there, if like your average American traveler was over there, and you realize like, oh my goodness, there's no public trash cans anywhere, and I want to throw away this bottle, you'd be disoriented, right? You'd be like, what's going on here? So that is culture shock. And lastly, we have the attitudes towards cultural variation. So what happens when we come across things that we're not familiar with, or that are just not normal to us? Well, one response is to be ethnocentric. So sometimes people assume that one's own culture and their way of life represents what's normal or what's superior to other cultures. So somebody going into Japan, like an ethnocentric person going into Japan, would make judgments like saying, "Oh, the Japanese, they're so dumb. How could they not put public trash cans everywhere? This is such an inconvenience. It's such an inconvenient culture." So that's not the right way to approach other cultures. The right way to approach other cultures is to use cultural relativism. So this is when you try to view people's behavior from the perspective of their own culture. So if the same person were to go to Japan and see that they have no public trash cans, they would be more open-minded about it. They'd say, wow, that's awesome. So like, that's great. So people don't make too much of a mess over here. They care about the environment and being wasteful. So they recycle everything, or they make sure that everything is like neat, and they're taking up as little space as possible. So that's how a cultural relativist would view that culture. And lastly, you have the three major theories. I'm not going to go over these. You could go ahead and read them. They're very self-explanatory. But if you want to know a little bit more about them, you can go ahead and look in your book. Anyhow, that's the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it.